Perhaps in these circumstances there emerges a greater freedom among educated people in talking about delicate subjects. So long as an objective and chaste attitude can be presupposed, what was formerly forbidden is now allowed. The sense of shame is restricted more to the matter itself and does not affect the word as a mere symbol. Thus the relation between reality and symbol fluctuates in narrower as well as in more general areas. One is almost inclined to think, though such generalities cannot be demonstrated, that either every stage of culture, and finally every nation, every group and every individual, displays a specific proportion between the symbolic and the directly realistic treatment of its interests, or else that this proportion is generally stable and only the objects that are affected by it are subject to change. But perhaps it may be stated more specifically that a conspicuous prevalence of symbolism is as much part of primitive and naive as of very highly developed and complicated stages of cultural development. It may be that the progressive development frees us from symbols in the realm of cognition, but makes us more dependent on them in practical matters. By contrast with the nebulous symbolism of mythological worldviews, modern philosophy shows an incomparable directness in its interpretation of objects. On the other hand, the extensive and intensive multiplication of life experiences has the result that we have to subsume, condense and represent them by symbolic forms to a greater extent than was necessary under simpler and more restricted conditions. Symbolism, which at lower cultural stages often means detours and waste of energy, is expedient and saves energy at the higher stages. One may think here of diplomatic techniques in the international as well as the party political sphere. Certainly, it is the relation between actual degrees of power that determines the outcome of the struggle between interests. But these are no longer measured against each other directly in a physical fight, they are represented conceptually. Behind the representative of each collective power stands in condensed potential form the real power of his party, and it is just in proportion to the latter that his voice is effective and his interest able to prevail. He himself is the symbol of this power. The intellectual exchange between the representatives of different power groups symbolizes the course that a real battle would have taken, in such fashion that the vanquished accepts the result as though he had really been defeated. I call to mind, for instance, the negotiations between employees and employers to avoid an impending strike. Each party yields just at the point which, according to its estimate of the respective strength of the parties, would be enforced by an actual strike. The ultima rationis is avoided by anticipating its results through imaginative devices. If such a representation and measurement of real strength could always be made accurately by the imagination, then every battle could be avoided. The utopian suggestion to decide the outcome of future wars by a game of chess between the generals is absurd, because the result of a game of chess does not give any indication of what would have been the outcome of a struggle between the armies, and so cannot symbolize and represent it in a valid way. However, a war game in which the whole armed forces, all fortuitous occurrences, all the intelligence of the leaders, found an appropriate symbolical expression, might possibly eliminate the physical struggle if such a game could be conceived. The multitude of factors, of powers, substances, and events that operate in modern life demand a concentration in comprehensive symbols which can be manipulated with the assurance that they will lead to the same result as if all the details had been taken into account, so that the result will be applicable and valid for all particulars. This should be possible to the extent that the quantitative relations between things become, so to speak, independent. The growing differentiation of our representations has the result that the problem of how much is, to a certain extent, psychologically separated from the question of what, no matter how strange this may sound from the logical point of view. It occurred first and most successfully in the construction of numbers, by extracting the so and so much out of so many things and making it into independent concepts. The more stable the concepts become with reference to their qualitative content, the more attention becomes focused upon their quantitative relations. Finally, the ideal of knowledge is seen as the dissolution of all the qualitative categories of reality into purely quantitative ones. This specification and emphasis of quantity facilitates the symbolic treatment of things. Since those that differ in content may coincide with respect to quantity, the relations, characteristics, and movements of one of them may provide a valid representation of those of another. The simplest examples are the tokens that represent the numerical value of any object, or the thermometer that shows the temperature in degrees. It may appear self-evident today that symbols should be created by segregating the quantitative aspects of things, but this is in fact an achievement of the human mind which has remarkable consequences. The institution of money depends upon it inasmuch as money represents pure quantity in a numerical form, regardless of all the specific qualities of a valued object. An account from ancient Russia illustrates a very characteristic transition from the qualitative to the quantitative symbolic representation. Originally, marten furs served as a means of exchange. As trade developed, the size and quality of individual pelts lost all significance for their exchange value. Each pelt simply equaled any other, and only the number of pelts mattered. Eventually, only the tips of the pelts were used as money, and finally pieces of leather, probably stamped by the government, circulated as a means of exchange. This clearly illustrates how the reduction to a quantitative viewpoint supports the symbolization of values, which is the basis for the genuine realization of money. However, it appears that at first ideal money does not meet the higher economic needs, although it is particularly suited for general acceptance, since it has no relation to particular values, but an equal relation to all of them. The extraordinary spread of cowrie money which was used for 1,000 years in a large part of Africa, at an earlier time in the region of the Indian Ocean, and in prehistoric times in Europe, would not have been possible if it had not been so genuinely ideal. At the lower economic stages, extreme contrasts of money values exist side by side. On the one hand, there is money which is entirely concrete in value, such as cattle or cotton cloth, which circulates when large amounts of money are involved, and on the other, there is completely ideal money such as crowie shells, the bark of the mulberry tree which Marco Polo discovered in China, or the pieces of porcelain with Chinese characters, which circulated in Siam. A certain functional development beyond the types of money with concrete value begins where natural products, which are at the same time export articles, become means of exchange. Tobacco in Virginia, rice in Carolina, cod in Newfoundland, tea in China, and furs in Massachusetts. In the case of export articles, value becomes psychologically separated from the immediacy which prevails in the domestic use of money.